Hi, my name is Kate Cheney, and this presentation, Podcasting to Empower People, is about the podcast, Sustainability and Resilience. Sustainability is complex and multifaceted. Conventionally, it's a triple bottom line approach. And culturally, it's thinking about your grandchildren, their children, and the world that we leave them. More scientifically, it's about a long-term systems thinking for a dynamic equilibrium for the planet's resource generation and um, how fast we consume it, as well as how much pollution and byproducts we create and how fast the Earth can absorb that pollution. So with all these definitions of sustainability, they unite us with a common green, uh, futuristic thinking where we care about the world and what humanity does to the world. However, the interpretations of sustainability are fairly ambiguous and don't exactly tell people what they can do to make choices for sustainability. They just tell you to think about future generations or the equilibrium of the system on the planet. So, sustainability challenges often require systems thinking because the challenges themselves are part of exceedingly complex and dynamic systems that include the social realm and political realms, the economic uh, realms, and also cultural aspects. All of these triple bottom line um, sectors going across the physical world and non-living world where they all of these challenges are part of wicked problems that because of the explosive change in our world's development within just one lifetime, we're seeing sustainability drivers such as competing for renewable as well as non-renewable resources, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation, the balance of global systems like the carbon system and hydrologic cycle, and social justice along with equitable economic globalization, just to name a few. So acting to change sustainability challenges within these systems can be understandably overwhelming and at times confusing because the systems don't always give you linear or simple outcomes. Many leaders around the world do encourage businesses and consumers to make sustainable choices because they are essential for success in a world with constrained resources. This is a favorite quote of mine from Jane Goodall. She says, "You cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and what you have to decide is what kind of difference you're going to make." It's essential for people to be aware and knowledgeable of how they fit into the world and the systems around them. These systems that are complex and adaptive make it hard to understand why choices are sustainable and how you can continuously improve to be better. But after learning about the various cause and effect relationships that impact the drivers of the sustainability problem, people can integrate these concepts into their own choices, their own lives, and maybe their own organizations and policies. Individuals making choices in their everyday can add up to substantial and far-reaching impacts in society. Once a person believes that they can make a difference in the world, they start being uh, um, much more discriminative in their actions. One thing leads to another, and even something as simple as changing a light bulb can be the first step to a series of innovations and sustainability changes. To be an effective change mechanism with the mainstream, including politics and education and the cultural practices we see in our everyday, it's important that a change idea reaches listeners and reaches these learners firsthand and engages with them in order for them to then take that information and use it in their everyday lives, impacting through cumulative through adding up these actions really do change the larger society. So there's a need for a multifaceted and engaging education or educational service that provides information about sustainability to the world at large. And I saw this need that could be met with a sustainability podcast. Through podcasting, I'm able to reach a wide audience and create an intimate connection with my listeners, as well as share my message with the world, which is make sustainable choices. And the podcast journal, which I really would recommend anybody read if they're going to start a podcast, recommended that when you decide you want to start a podcast, you start with identifying what your passions are and what your life experiences are. For me, my two passions, scientific sustainability problem solving, then got to join my other passion of comedic entertainment. So bridging the science and entertainment, I knew I wanted to empower other people to be confident to make sustainable choices. And I created this podcast to drive momentum towards societal shifts and those cumulative actions that can change the world. And sustainability and resilience was the podcast that was created. And here with this podcast, it's an it's an optimistic podcast that explores sustainability issues. And we journey, Brian Perkins, my co-host, and I journey through thought-provoking, science-based sustainability challenges with a bit of humor and comedic relief to entertain and empower listeners to know what sustainable choices are, and most importantly, why. The podcast uses systems thinking to provide listeners with a holistic understanding of the challenge at hand and what they can do in their everyday choices to act on that. Listeners can find us on all major platforms, including iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and Spotify. So I want to go back to how I created the podcast. When I first started, I did some foundational research, including a feasibility study, where I researched the audience, potential target audience, other podcasters, what they were doing well and what they could improve on. the market niche, the value that this podcast brought to people and to the project team, as well as financing options, as podcasts can become eventually profitable. So while this feasibility study was going on, I also did a lot of audience research where I studied how to inspire people to act on changes that I encourage them to, and came up with a communication plan, as well as conducting a sustainability SWOT analysis. So the planning stage and the foundational research really covered what I wanted to say and why I wanted to say it, and then how I was going to say it, and through what means was I going to say it. And so our this stakeholder engagement was really planned out, and the engagements were the podcasts themselves, as well as any testing and feedback that I got from test episodes, which turned out to be a large part of the project, was incorporating the feedback that I received from my stakeholder engagements into the action plan for the podcast and the communication plan for the podcast going forward. So that when I then engaged with my stakeholders again with the next podcast, it incorporated things that they liked and altered things that they didn't like or thought that needed adding. For example, our listener write-in program and blog were added because of listener feedback during the test episodes. So stakeholder engagement really showed me a better idea of what I wanted to create, and through many renditions, the podcast came to a place where I could create a work breakdown structure with the project roughly sketched out for the amount of hours that tasks would take, what tasks were needed, who was going to do that task or help me with that task, and any resources or risks involved with that task. And from that work breakdown structure, I made a Gantt chart, which then helped me schedule this year-long process of creating the podcast and everything that I needed to do. And so, staying on track with the Gantt chart, I began to design my logo and my infographics for the podcast website and our social media. You can find us on sustainabilitypod.com, also on Facebook and Instagram. Check out our blog, Sustainablog, on sustainabilitypod.com. Every blog covers a topic for the podcast, and listeners can find out more about the topic and see our resources. And so during our actual recording, we recorded an alpha test episode and a beta test episode, for which we researched and wrote, recorded and edited, and then sent to a listener feedback test group, and then got that feedback and incorporated it into the next episode. And the third time was the charm. It was our pilot episode, and this was the one that you can go listen to right now on any of the platforms I mentioned earlier. We released this episode and have been compiling all of our listener feedback, and after we decided that it was the episode approved to be released to the public, we applied to be on the different platforms available for podcasts and set up an RSS feed with a hosting service. And you can find us in the category science, subsection comedy, or by searching us. Here we have some metrics of the release of the podcast first episode, and we have about 70 downloads. You can see this downloads over time graph on the screen, as well as a sample of the demographic information available to us after we get more downloads. And these and the feedback from this episode has been really great, but has also brought us to a very collaborative and restructuring of our project team, where we found that the framework for developing our episode topics needed to be adjusted. And so the approach for scoping our challenges changed to involve systems thinking as a tool, and then our framework for developing the episode topics also heavily relied on systems thinking. And so I'd like to share with you the systems diagram for the upcoming episode on Chesapeake Bay oysters. Now, this is a lot, and I wanted to include this so that I could show you how I got here using systems thinking in this framework developed for the podcast. So using systems thinking among a couple other concepts, the structure for selecting topics involves creating an initial systems diagram after the prospective topic has been researched a little bit. And then from that initial causal loop diagram, creating clear boundaries for a 45-minute episode or a series of 45-minute episodes. And then once you have your topic, the framework developed for creating the meat of the podcast involves researching more variables with a global lens, and then creating simple causal loops, and within maybe a larger causal loop that I showed you on the previous slide. And on that larger causal loop, and also within the simpler causal loops, you can pinpoint leverage points for action and clear choices for sustainability. So really driving the change on those sustainability challenges with choices. And so those choices are, need to be easy, actionable, and achievable, also effective. Calls to action for the audience members. And another important point is to keep track of discussion questions during the research phase, because the discussion questions at the end are what listeners will write in with our write-in program and continue the conversation and really just explore and engage sustainability, as well as create a sense of community, because I know I really enjoy my senses of community with the listener write-in program receiving them. So our choices make a difference and can add up to societal shifts that can change the world for the better. And it's important to recognize how complex the world is today and ask, how do you know what a sustainable choice is? Well, have no worries, because Sustainability and Resilience Podcast is here. And we're alongside you while we all adapt to a changing world. And we will use systems thinking to pinpoint realistic, actionable items that empower our listeners with a broad spectrum of sustainability knowledge for making everyday choices. Listen today for a more sustainable tomorrow.